Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm Greg Mullen. I'm an assistant professor of biology. I am a geneticist by training and most recently a neurobiologist. I've been studying how the nervous system develops and how nerves communicate with other nerves and other. Okay, so twin studies are quite important for studying the heritable component of mental illnesses. So basically the way they're conducted is that you look at both identical or monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. And what you're trying to do is look for the degree to which twins will share a particular, for example, psychiatric disorder. And so in the case of dizygotic twins, which are non-identical twins, then they will tend to share about 50% of their genes. And so if there's a strong genetic component to it, you'll tend to see that manifested in what we call the concordance rate, which is basically when one of the twin has it, the other twin has it as well. And so the degree to which that happens is the concordance rate. Excuse me, sorry. But if you look at monozygotic twins, what you'll tend to see is that will be elevated even further because they're genetically identical. And so, for example, with some psychiatric disorders, you'll see, for example, say, for example, 40% concordance between non-identical twins, and then you'll see something even higher, so 60, 70% between identical twins. And that tells you there's a strong genetic component to it. Okay, well, so first of all, a lot of them do have strong genetic components. So they've done twin studies, for example, on schizophrenia, I think are probably the best characterized. And there's every evidence that, for example, if you have one member of an identical twin has schizophrenia, there's at least a 40 to 50% chance that the other identical twin will have that as well. And so for schizophrenia, there's definitely a strong genetic component to it. Other psychiatric disorders, things like generalized anxiety disorder, what are some of the other ones? ADHD, also definitely have a strong genetic component to them. So when you look at identical twins, there's a good chance that one is affected, the other will be as well. Well, okay, so you mean in those situations where we separate twins at birth and
Yes.
then, so a lot of times there's a tendency, for example, for people to adopt children of similar ethnicity, for example. Often, in some cases, they'll be even in the same socioeconomic class, things like that. So there'll be often environmental conditions that end up being in common between the adoptive family and the biological family anyway. And so sometimes we don't account for those as well. Okay, well, I think that, first of all, these are legitimate biological conditions, medical conditions in some cases that you need to treat as such. And so I think it's important that parents avail themselves of proper care. Historically, there's been kind of a stigma against this, partly because of the general stigma that mental disorders or psychiatric disorders have in our society. And partly also parents, for a while, were actually blamed for conditions like autism and schizophrenia. There's a so-called refrigerator parent notion, which was that schizophrenia and autism were caused by cold parenting. So I think parents are reluctant to take their kids to seek care. I think it's important that they do, because if they get proper treatment, which could be behavioral modification and it could be, in some cases, it could be medications, the quality of life can really be improved. So I think it's really important that they do that. Well, I think fortunately that stigmas are, that's become less of a problem. People have become more accepting of the fact that these have a genetic basis, and so you come into the world with perhaps, for example, a strong predisposition or risk for a certain disorder. So people are becoming more accepting of it, but I think there still is a stigma against treating these as real legitimate biological conditions. And so I think it's important that people start to get more comfortable in dealing with them as genuine illness, seeking treatment whenever they can. I do feel that people like Tom Cruise, for example, have done us a big disservice by promoting mental illness as a weakness of character or all in the mind rather than a legitimate biological condition. I think there's always the possibility of over-medicating, especially when kids have been through, for example, traumatic early childhood experiences that may not bring out the best in their character. But at the same time, I do think these are pretty prevalent conditions, and medication is sometimes the appropriate response. And And so I think it's a little bit of both. I think they are prevalent, but at the same time, it's probably easy to medicate an active child so that they are less active. Well, actually, so they do these adoption studies where they separate, where twins who have been separated through adoption, or just simply when children have been adopted in general, what they tend to find is those genetic susceptibilities hold up pretty well. So, for example, if you were to separate identical twins, one of whom has schizophrenia, if you were to separate them at birth, you're still a very strong likelihood of that other twin who was separated also being diagnosed as schizophrenia, about 50% in fact. So those genetic concordance rates tend to hold up pretty well when the twins have been separated at birth, which really points to, like I say, a strong genetic component to it. And in some cases that the environment is not so important. That's also true with intelligence, for example. Intelligence actually has a very strong genetic component, and even if you separate identical twins at birth, they end up with approximately the same IQs, even though their living environment, the conditions, family life may be totally